Let's get started. Story number 1.
The first time I heard about the place, it was from my grandmother. She grew up deep in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky, where the hills roll on forever, and the forest is so thick that the sun barely touches the ground. She told me stories when I was a kid, whispered legends of old moonshiners, lost souls, and woods that never forget. But there was one story she never told me until much later, and that one stayed with me longer than all the others. I was visiting her when she finally spoke of it, almost reluctantly, as if saying the words aloud would stir something better left alone. "There's a hollow not far from here," she said, eyes clouded with something between fear and sorrow. "Old Man Crow lived there. Folks say he was a strange one. Some called him a witch, others said he was just lonely. But no one went near his cabin after dark, not for a long time." I was curious, but she warned me, "If you ever find yourself near Crow Hollow, be careful. The woods don't take kindly to strangers, and neither does Old Man Crow." At the time, I laughed it off. Ghost stories, right? Just local legend to keep kids from wandering too far. But when I found myself in that part of Kentucky a few years later, the story came back. I was working on a project about Appalachian history and had come to stay in a small town not far from where my grandmother grew up. My research led me to old maps and newspaper clippings about Crow Hollow, a remote valley tucked between two ridges, nearly forgotten by time. Locals were cagey about it. At the diner, the waitress gave me a quick glance and said, "You're not looking to wander into Crow Hollow, are you? Folks don't talk much about it." I told her I was just curious about the history. She shook her head and warned me to stay on the main roads. One afternoon, with the sun slanting low and golden over the ridges, I found the narrow dirt road that led into Crow Hollow. The trees arched overhead, thick and tangled, branches heavy with moss and shadows. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. At the end of the road was the cabin, old and weathered, its wood gray and cracked, windows dark like empty eyes. The porch sagged and vines crawled up the sides. It looked abandoned, but somehow alive, like the forest was holding its breath. I stepped closer, camera in hand, snapping pictures. As I moved around the cabin, the air turned colder. A breeze whispered through the trees, carrying a faint smell of smoke and something else, something faintly sweet and rotten. Suddenly, I heard a voice behind me. "Don't be here." I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one. Just the trees, swaying gently. I laughed nervously and told myself it was the wind. But the voice came again. Soft, urgent. "Leave before night." I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to stay, to find out more, but the warning lingered. That night, in the small motel I was staying at, I couldn't sleep. The words echoed in my mind, and my skin crawled with an uneasy energy. I decided to go back to the cabin the next day, in the daylight, to see if I could find any clues. When I returned, the sun was higher, casting dappled light through the canopy. I searched around the cabin's perimeter and found an old well, covered with rotting boards. Nearby were rusted tools, and the ground was disturbed, as if someone had been digging recently. I took pictures and notes, but then I noticed footprints, barefoot and small, leading into the woods. I hesitated, but followed them anyway. The forest grew darker and cooler as I walked. Birds quieted, and the usual sounds of woodland life faded. The path twisted through thick underbrush until I came to a clearing. In the center stood a circle of stones, worn smooth by time. In the middle lay a wooden box, old and weathered. I knelt and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were fragments of cloth, a locket, and a faded photograph of a young girl. A sudden rustle behind me made me jump. I turned but saw only a flash of movement, a pale figure slipping behind a tree. My heart hammered and I felt a deep, sinking dread. I rushed back to the cabin, but as I crossed the clearing, I heard soft crying, clear and pure, like a child sobbing carried on the wind. I froze. The sound drew me toward the cabin's porch, where I found a small doll, dirty and worn, sitting on the steps. I picked it up, and the crying stopped abruptly. The rest of the day passed in a haze, and I left Crow Hollow as dusk fell. But the experience haunted me. That night, strange things began happening. I heard footsteps outside my motel room, but when I looked, no one was there. The air grew cold, and the lights flickered. I dreamed of the girl, her eyes wide, sorrowful, reaching out to me. She whispered my name, calling for help. The next morning, I went back to the town and found the local librarian, Mrs. Thompson. She was a quiet woman with knowing eyes and a gentle manner. I showed her the photograph and doll. She sighed deeply. "That's Mary Crow," she said. Old Man Crow's daughter. She died out in the woods nearly 100 years ago. No one knows how. Some say she was taken by the forest, others that her father did something terrible. I asked if anyone had ever tried to find her. Many have, but the woods don't give up their secrets. Those who wander in Crow Hollow after dark sometimes never come back. Others come back changed, haunted. That night, I sat in my room, heart pounding as the temperature dropped. The whispering returned, growing louder and more insistent. "Help me." I felt compelled to return to the cabin one last time. As I approached the porch, a figure stood there, the girl, translucent and glowing faintly. Her eyes pleaded. "Please," she said, voice trembling, "find the truth. Set me free." I nodded, though my hands trembled. I spent the following days digging through old archives, piecing together a tragic story of a father driven mad by grief and suspicion, who may have hidden his daughter's body deep in the forest, hoping to keep her from a fate he feared worse than death. One evening, armed with a shovel and a lantern, I ventured into the woods, following old clues and gut instinct. The forest seemed alive, watching. After hours, I found a shallow grave beneath an ancient oak tree, marked by a single crooked branch. I dug carefully and uncovered bones wrapped in tattered cloth. I whispered a prayer, and the air shifted. The oppressive weight lifted slightly. I stayed with the bones until dawn, speaking softly, promising to tell her story. When I returned to the cabin, the temperature warmed, the shadows retreated. For the first time, the whispering stopped. I left the mountains the next day, forever changed. Some stories in the Appalachians aren't just tales. They're echoes of lives lost and souls waiting for peace. And sometimes, if you listen, the mountains will tell you their secrets. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The Appalachian Mountains were never a place I imagined I'd end up. Not permanently. I grew up in Richmond, spent most of my adult life in D.C., and outside of the occasional weekend hike or vacation cabin rental, the mountains were always just background, something scenic to look at, not live in. But after the divorce, after Dad passed, after the job at the architectural firm collapsed during a round of layoffs, I needed somewhere to go that wasn't familiar. My sister-in-law Ellie offered the old family cabin. It had been sitting empty for years, tucked deep in a holler outside Boone, North Carolina. She said I could stay as long as I needed. I figured a couple months, just enough to reset. It took me an entire afternoon to find the place. GPS gave up after the first 40 minutes, and I ended up relying on Ellie's handwritten directions, which involved references to barns that no longer existed and bridges that had been washed out for years. By the time I pulled up the gravel drive and saw the moss-covered shingles and dark windows, I felt like I was arriving in another century. The forest seemed to lean in on the house, as if trying to reclaim it. Inside, it was dusty but not trashed. The wood floors groaned under my boots, and the air was thick with mildew and something else. Old smoke, maybe, or just age. The house didn't have electricity. There was a fireplace, a hand pump at the sink, and 2 bedrooms upstairs with iron-framed beds and thin mattresses. Ellie said she and her cousins used to spend summers there, but that stopped after one of the cousins drowned in a creek nearby. She didn't say much more, and I didn't ask. The first week was quiet. I chopped wood, read by lantern light, walked the trails around the property. The nights were deep, black, and silent. The kind of quiet that pressed into your ears like cotton. I'd lie awake and listen to the house settle, the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of something in the underbrush. I told myself I liked it. It felt raw and real, like something I hadn't known I needed. The first odd thing was the smell. It started around the 8th day, a sour, earthy stink, like wet leaves mixed with meat gone bad. I thought maybe something had died under the porch. I looked, but didn't find anything. No animal, no nest, not even a spot disturbed. The smell would come and go. Sometimes it was strongest near the fireplace, sometimes upstairs in the hallway. Then came the dreams. They weren't like normal dreams. They didn't fade in the morning, didn't lose their edges. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, certain I hadn't been alone. The dreams were always the same. I'd be standing in the forest at night, barefoot, wearing clothes I didn't recognize. There was a humming sound in the trees, soft and rhythmic, like someone singing far away. I'd look down and see my hands covered in dirt, fingernails torn, and I'd be standing over a hole, a shallow grave. Something would move behind me and I'd turn, but I never saw what it was. Just felt it, watching. On the 11th night, I woke up to find the front door wide open. It hadn't been windy, and I know I locked it. There were no tracks in the dirt, no animals inside, just that smell, stronger now, almost unbearable. I shut the door, lit a lantern, and checked the rooms. Nothing. I told myself it was my imagination, that maybe the latch had failed. The next day, I walked to the creek. It was half an hour downhill, where the trees grew thicker and light barely filtered through. Ellie had mentioned it, said it's where her cousin died, though she didn't give details. The water was clear, moving slow, but I noticed something strange near the bank. Rocks stacked neatly in little towers, some of them up to my knee. There were at least 20 of them, scattered in no pattern. It looked like something a child might do, but too orderly, too consistent. I kicked one over. It toppled with a soft splash. That night, I dreamed again. Only this time, I was standing in the creek, and the towers of rocks were there, but broken, scattered. I felt the water freezing around my ankles, heard that same humming from the woods, then a voice behind me, soft and whispering, "You broke it." I woke up gasping, and my hands were filthy. Real dirt under my nails streaked on my shirt as if I'd been digging. The next morning, I packed a bag. I planned to hike back to the road, find a motel, get a few nights of real sleep. But the weather turned fast. Gray clouds rolled in like smoke, and by noon the rain was hammering down hard enough to wash out the trail. I made it maybe a mile before I had to turn back. The forest felt wrong. The trees looked twisted, darker than they had the day before. Sounds echoed strangely. I kept thinking I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, shapes darting behind trunks. Back inside, soaked and shivering, I lit a fire and changed into dry clothes. The house groaned louder now, as if it resented me being there. I stood in front of the mirror above the old dresser and stared at my face. My eyes looked wrong, sunken, pale, like I hadn't slept in weeks. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Not an animal, not branches, slow, deliberate steps. I grabbed the lantern and the old hatchet I kept by the fireplace. When I opened the door, the porch was empty, but on the steps was another stack of rocks. This time, there were teeth on top. Human teeth. 5 of them. Yellowed and cracked. I didn't go back to sleep. The next morning, the smell was in every room. I tried burning sage I'd found in the pantry, but it didn't help. Around noon, I noticed the picture frames in the hallway had been turned face down. Every one of them. I hadn't touched them. The dreams got worse. I was in the forest again. But this time I was digging, fast and frantic, dirt flying. Someone stood nearby, their face hidden by shadow. The humming grew louder until it felt like my skull was vibrating. When I stopped digging, I saw what was buried, a small rotting body. A child, its mouth open in a silent scream, its eyes missing. "You're the last," the voice said. "It needs to end." I woke up screaming. I tried the truck the next day. It wouldn't start. Battery was fine. Engine was fine. It just wouldn't turn over, like something was stopping it. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, trying not to cry. The porch steps were covered in mud that night, bare footprints, child-size, leading up to the door, then disappearing. I nailed the door shut. At some point during the night, something whispered through the walls. It said my name. On the 14th day, I hiked back to the creek. The towers were back, every one of them rebuilt. But now there were dolls hanging from the trees, dozens of them, handmade from twigs and scraps of cloth, some missing limbs, some with no eyes. They swayed gently, even though the air was still. I turned and saw something across the water, a figure, small. Standing half in shadow, it didn't move. I ran. When I got back to the cabin, the front door was open again. Inside, it was cold, unnaturally cold, like winter had spilled inside. My breath fogged the air. Every surface was covered in dirt, the walls, the floors, even the ceiling. It looked like the house had been buried and then unearthed. On the wall above the fireplace, scratched deep into the wood, was a word. Return. I left everything. I ran. Through the forest, across the hills, all the way to the road. I didn't stop until I found a farmhouse with lights on. The family let me in, called Ellie. I didn't tell them what I saw. I never went back. Ellie said the cabin was torn down a year later after squatters set it on fire. But she called me a few weeks ago, said something strange. They were clearing brush near the creek and found bones. Small ones. A child's, likely. And a necklace, one Ellie said she remembered her cousin wearing. They also found something carved into a nearby tree. It said, "You broke it." Story the end.
Story number 3.
I was raised in a small town just outside the Blue Ridge Mountains in western North Carolina. My grandparents owned a modest cabin deeper in the range, a spot where the road turned to gravel and the gravel eventually just became dirt. That cabin was my childhood summer retreat. Nothing fancy, just a wood stove, creaky floorboards, and a front porch that overlooked a sea of trees. No Wi-Fi, no TV, just woods and stories. My grandfather Calvin had 100 of them. Most were about wildlife, hunting trips, or run-ins with folks he referred to as mountain strange, people who lived too far from town for too long and weren't right in the head anymore. But there was one story he only told once, and I didn't hear it until he was already dying. He'd been in and out of the hospital, and I was sitting with him late one evening in his cabin while my mom drove into town for medicine. Rain tapped at the tin roof, the fire was low, and he turned to me and said, "You ever heard about the White Pine Trail?" I shook my head. He told me that in the early 60s, before he met my grandmother, he used to log up near Spruce Hollow, an area not even marked on current maps. One day, he and two other men, Billy Tucker and James Petrie, got a contract to clear out some trees past the hollow for a rumored resort development. "No one's gone that deep in 50 years, he said. "We thought it was just old forest, maybe some old mining camps, but what we found wasn't right." They spent the first day setting up camp and prepping gear. That night, Calvin said the forest sounded different. It wasn't quiet, not at first, he told me. There were these clicks all around, like a big insect tapping its legs against wood. We figured it was just bugs or some bird we hadn't seen. The second day, Billy went missing, just gone, left his boots by the fire and disappeared. They spent hours searching, like yelling his name, following broken twigs and what looked like a trail, but nothing. Then, around dusk, they found something hanging from a branch. It was Billy's shirt, soaked in something dark, and tucked into the collar was a white pine cone. Just one. But Calvin said it looked wrong, like it had been shaped, almost carved. I asked him why he didn't go to the police. He looked at me, eyes glossed with age and fear, because when we went back to the truck, it was gone. Not stolen, just gone. No tire marks, no road, like we never drove it up there at all. They were stuck for 2 more nights. The second night, James heard someone calling his name outside the tent, over and over. Same tone, same rhythm, every 20 seconds. But Calvin swore no one else was out there. When he looked, there was nothing, but James swore it was Billy's voice, only stretched, distorted, like someone chewing on the words before spitting them out. By the third morning, James had gone mad, clawing at the trees, trying to rip his way through the forest like it was a curtain. He kept yelling, "They're in the bark!" Calvin had to tackle him to keep him from running. Then they heard the knocking. 3 loud knocks, like a massive fist pounding on wood. It came from the woods, maybe 20 feet out, then another set, closer. They didn't wait after that. Calvin said he started walking. No compass, no trail, just sheer desperation. He walked for what felt like hours until the trees began to thin, and he collapsed near an old fire road. A ranger found him 2 days later. No one ever saw James again. I asked him if he went back. He just laughed. "You don't go back to a place like that. You don't even look for it. You just pray the trees forget you." He died a week later. I thought maybe the story was just a mix of pain meds and age. But 10 years later, when my girlfriend and I planned a weekend hiking trip in the Appalachians, something strange happened. We found it. We were up near the Blue Ridge Parkway, trying to take the scenic route to a waterfall when our GPS went haywire. The road signs got confusing, some in different fonts, some with names I didn't recognize. Eventually, we turned onto a narrow gravel road that dipped between 2 ridgelines. I figured it was just one of those unnamed back routes. It felt familiar, but I chalked it up to growing up nearby. Then the forest started to change. The pines got tall and thick, almost uniform. They weren't scattered like the rest of the woods. They stood in strange lines, perfectly spaced, as if planted with purpose. Every fifth tree had bark that peeled in the shape of vertical eyes. My girlfriend, Lacey, noticed first. Do you hear that? It was clicking. Not cicadas, not crickets, just loud, a rhythmic clicking, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Then we passed an old, rusted truck cab half buried in the brush. I stopped the car. It was stripped down to the frame, tires long gone, but the shape of the hood, it looked like something from the 1950s or 60s. On the roof was a white pine cone, still perfectly shaped, sitting upright. Lacey wanted to leave. So did I. But the road behind us had changed. It looked steeper, darker, and my phone had no signal. We pressed on, praying to loop back to civilization. A few minutes later, we spotted something through the trees. A structure. It was too small to be a house, too crude to be a shed. It was made of logs and stacked stone, no windows, just a dark entrance. Lacey said it looked like a burial hut. Against better judgment, I stopped and got out. Inside was a circle of pine cones, all white, bleached and shaped. In the center lay a shirt, ripped and rotting. When I flipped it over, the name stitched on the inside collar made my blood run cold. B. Tucker. I nearly vomited. We ran back to the car and started driving, but the road ahead split into three paths, none of which we recognized. I picked the one that looked best maintained. Bad choice. The road narrowed to the point that the branches scraped the side of the car. It felt like the forest was folding in. Then we saw them. Figures. Not solid. Not flesh. But there, tall and pale, with skin that shimmered like wet paper. They stood between the trees, unmoving, featureless. Just watching. When I sped up, one of them shifted, its head following us like a weather vane. Then it stepped forward, its legs bent wrong, joints too high up, and the clicking started again, louder this time, echoing through the woods. I gunned the car. Branches whipped the windshield. Something scraped the undercarriage, and then, out of nowhere, the road dropped. It was like we drove off a ledge. We landed hard, nose down, in a shallow creek. The engine sputtered and died. We were stuck. We left the car and ran through the trees. No direction, no trail, just panic. I kept thinking about what Calvin said. They're in the bark. I started seeing things in the trees, faces just beneath the wood. Eyes, mouths, all twisted and open like they were screaming. Lacey fell. I pulled her up, but her ankle was twisted bad. We limped together until we reached a clearing. That's when I saw it. A line of stone markers, 4 of them, no names. Just those same ancient symbols Calvin described, circles, slashes, animal shapes. In the center, a fire pit. Cold, but the ash was fresh. Around the perimeter were more pine cones, dozens. Lacey started crying. We need to go, now. But I was frozen. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head. You just pray the trees forget you. Then, behind us, that knock came again. Not close, not far, just steady. Boom, boom, boom. The forest groaned. I swear it groaned like it was breathing in reverse. We turned to run, and everything changed. It wasn't the same forest. The trees had shifted, grown taller, denser. The ground felt soft, spongy, like we were walking on something dead. We kept moving, and somehow, through what must have been hours, we came out on a road. A real road. Asphalt. We flagged down a ranger's truck. The man inside looked pale when we told him where we'd been. He didn't ask many questions, just drove us straight to town. I tried to find that road again a few weeks later, using the GPS history, but it wasn't there. No record of it. No mention of Spruce Hollow either. I've lived near these mountains all my life, but I've never gone back to that area. Sometimes, though, on quiet nights when the wind moves just right, I hear a clicking sound in the trees behind the house. And sometimes I find a pine cone on the porch, bleached white, perfectly shaped. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The summer I turned 22, I took a job working at a remote lodge nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Tennessee. It was the kind of place you'd imagine only a few people knew about, tucked away between ridges and valleys, miles from the nearest town. My shift was as a night receptionist, mostly just handling last-minute bookings and the occasional phone call. But the lodge had a reputation for being eerie after dark, something the regular staff whispered about but never fully explained. I didn't believe in ghosts. Growing up in the city, I thought all those stories were just superstitions meant to scare kids or sell more history books. But this place changed my mind, and I know what I experienced that summer was as real as the mountains themselves. On my first night, I was introduced to the lodge by an older man named Roy, the caretaker. He was quiet but friendly enough, his skin weathered like the bark of the oak trees surrounding the property. Roy warned me about the old section of the lodge, a wing shut down since the 50s after a fire that took the lives of 2 guests. The owners decided never to repair it, sealing it off behind locked doors. "Most guests don't even know it's there," Roy said, his voice low. "But sometimes, if you listen real close, you can hear things coming from those rooms." I laughed it off, but Roy's face didn't change. "You'll see. The mountains don't forget." The first few nights were uneventful. I spent most of the time reading or watching the fire crackle in the lobby fireplace while the rain drummed softly on the tin roof. The lodge sat at about 3,000 feet elevation, and the chill that crept in after sunset was biting even in summer. Then, on my 4th night, things began to shift. It was around midnight when the phone on the front desk started ringing. The screen showed a number from the main lodge kitchen, so I picked up. "This is Jake," I said. No answer. Then, from the other end, a faint breathing like someone struggling to get air. My heart rate sped up. "Hello? Kitchen? You okay?" Nothing but silence. I hung up and called Roy's room, but he didn't answer. Strange, since he usually slept with the door cracked open. As I sat there wondering if I should check on him, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the floor above, the old wing. Heavy boots shuffling against the creaky wooden boards. But that wing was supposed to be empty and locked tight. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the stairs, which groaned under my weight. The air felt thicker, heavier, like breathing through a damp cloth. Halfway up, I stopped. A cold breeze brushed past me, carrying a faint scent of smoke and something else, something metallic and old. The footsteps had stopped, but now I could hear whispers. Low, unintelligible murmurs echoing through the hallway. I reached the locked door at the end of the hall, the one leading to the fire-damaged rooms. The wood was charred and blackened, but the lock was rusty and old. As I shone my flashlight at it, I saw scratches along the doorframe, deep, claw-like gouges. A sudden tapping sounded from the other side. 3 taps, then a pause, then 3 taps again. I swallowed hard, heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. I reached for my phone to call Roy again, but it slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. When I bent to pick it up, the tapping stopped. I hurried downstairs, locking the old wing door behind me. The next morning, Roy told me a story I wish I never heard. Decades ago, in the early 1950s, a family checked into the lodge during a bad storm. The father, his wife, and their young son. The boy, they said, had been sick for weeks with a fever and nightmares. The lodge was full, so they were assigned to the old wing. On the second night, a fire broke out, probably from faulty wiring or a knocked-over candle. The parents escaped, but the boy was trapped inside. His body was never found. Locals said the boy's spirit lingered, restless and lost, trapped between the flames and the cold mountain air. Sometimes guests reported seeing a pale boy in soaked pajamas wandering the halls, or hearing tapping at their doors. Roy said the tapping I heard was a warning, a call from the boy's ghost, trying to communicate, to warn someone, maybe me. I tried to dismiss it, but that night I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next week, the hauntings grew stronger. Guests reported cold spots in their rooms, the sound of footsteps when no one else was around, and whispers carried on the mountain wind. One evening, while sitting by the fireplace, I found an old journal tucked inside a drawer behind the front desk. The leather was cracked, and the pages yellowed with age. It belonged to a woman named Clara, who had worked at the lodge during the 40s. Her entries described the boy, named Samuel, as sweet but troubled. She wrote about the night of the fire, how the lodge had been built over an ancient burial ground, and how strange things had been happening ever since. One passage chilled me. "They say the mountain spirits protect this land, but they also claim those who disrespect it. Samuel's death is tied to the land's unrest. The boy's soul cannot rest until the old wounds are healed." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing tapping on the windows and soft crying outside. I decided to visit the nearby cemetery the next day, a small clearing deep in the woods where many of the lodge's original builders and their families were buried. Walking through the rows of moss-covered stones, I found a grave with no name, just a simple wooden cross, weathered and broken. Near it lay a white pine cone, pristine and out of place among the dirt and dead leaves. A shiver ran down my spine. I brought the pine cone back to the lodge and placed it on the mantelpiece by the fireplace. That evening, the temperature in the lobby dropped sharply, and I saw a faint silhouette of a small boy near the hearth, looking at me with sad eyes before fading into the shadows. Determined to put the restless spirit to peace, I researched the mountain's history and found that long ago, the Cherokee people considered the area sacred. They believed the pine tree was a symbol of eternal life and connection to the spirit world. I arranged for a small ceremony, inviting a local Cherokee elder to bless the land and the lodge, hoping it might ease the boy's pain. During the ceremony, as the elder chanted prayers, a soft wind swept through the trees outside. I felt a warmth in the air, and for the first time in weeks, the oppressive weight seemed to lift. That night, the tapping stopped. Guests reported peaceful sleeps, and the lodge felt lighter, less haunted. But sometimes when I'm alone in the lobby late at night, I still hear faint footsteps overhead, and the scent of smoke and pine lingers in the air. The mountains don't forget. Neither do the spirits. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The Appalachian Mountains have always held a certain mystique, a quiet power that hums beneath the towering pines and endless ridges. Growing up in the foothills of North Carolina, I heard plenty of stories, some tall tales, some warnings passed down through generations, but there was one that my grandfather told me over and over that I never quite forgot. Not because it was the scariest story, but because it felt real, almost like a memory disguised as a ghost story. My grandfather, a coal miner turned logger, was born and raised in a tiny mountain hollow called Sugar Camp, a place so isolated that on foggy days, the world beyond seemed like a distant dream. The people there had a connection to the land that ran deeper than the roots of the trees. They believed in spirits, some protective, some vengeful, but none were as feared as the one known simply as the Whisperer. I never heard anyone else talk about the Whisperer, and when I asked my grandfather, he would lean in, lower his voice, and say, "Son, there's some things in these mountains that ain't right. Ain't meant for us to see or hear. The Whisperer's one of them." He said the story started back in the early 1900s, when a man named Eli Preston moved into a small cabin near the ridge above Sugar Camp. Eli was a loner, a hunter and trapper who came from the West. Folks said he didn't talk much and carried a worn leather satchel wherever he went, filled with strange herbs and talismans he claimed kept evil at bay. One winter, a harsh one with snow up to your knees and ice thick on the creeks, Eli's neighbors started hearing something strange from the woods. At first, it was just faint murmurs, like the wind shifting through the leaves, but then the voices grew clearer. Soft whispers carried by the wind, words in a language no one recognized. Folks swore the voices came from no one, or maybe something not quite alive. One night, a group of men from the hollow decided to check on Eli. When they reached his cabin, they found the door hanging open and the place empty, except for a circle of strange symbols scratched into the floorboards. Outside, the snow had been trampled in a wide arc, but no footprints led away. After that, the whispers followed the men back home. They'd hear them at night, low and persistent, calling names they hadn't spoken aloud in years. Some said the whispers promised power, others said they were threats. A few men went mad and wandered off into the woods, never to return. Others died under mysterious circumstances, falling from cliffs, disappearing during hunts. My grandfather said the entire hollow was haunted for months, and even after the voices stopped, people felt watched. They started leaving Sugar Camp, moving to towns down in the valleys. The woods seemed darker, colder. The mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath. I didn't think much of the story at the time. I was a kid, more interested in catching frogs than old ghost tales. But when I was 22, I took a summer job as a forest ranger, patrolling the same mountains where my grandfather grew up. I figured it'd be good money, and I wanted to reconnect with those woods that had shaped my family. That first week on the job, I was assigned to a remote section near the old Sugar Camp Hollow. The cabin ruins were still there, half swallowed by moss and vines. The air smelled different around them, damp, earthy, but with a sharp bite, like the scent of wet leaves and decay mixed together. I set up my camp a mile away from the ruins, close to a small creek. At night, The woods around me were alive with sounds, owl calls, rustling branches, the distant hoot of a barred owl. But on the third night, I started hearing something else, faint whispering, just beyond the edge of the firelight. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe my imagination. The next night, it was louder, almost like words. But I couldn't understand what they said. I asked around the ranger station about the hollow and the strange noises. The older rangers gave me wary looks, but one man, old Hank, finally leaned over and said, "You got ears for listening, boy. Those woods remember. They whisper to those who don't belong or those who look too deep. Be careful where you wander at night." I took his advice seriously, but curiosity gnawed at me. One night, I decided to follow the whispers. I left my camp with a flashlight and walked toward the old cabin ruins. The forest was thick, the ground soft with pine needles and moss. The whispering grew louder as I got closer. I could almost make out the words, but they were twisted and broken, like a song half remembered. Then I saw it, a figure standing just past the ruins. She was a woman, pale and thin, wearing an old dress stained with mud and leaves. Her hair hung long and tangled, and her eyes shone with a faint blue light. She didn't speak, just stared with that eerie glow. I froze. "Who are you?" I finally whispered. She raised a finger to her lips and faded into the shadows, disappearing like mist. I stumbled back to camp, heart racing, mind reeling. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I found strange symbols scratched into a tree near the ruins, circles, triangles, and lines that looked like ancient runes. I took pictures and sent them to a local historian who told me they resembled Cherokee symbols used in protective rites. But there was something off, like a corruption or distortion. That night, the whispers came again. This time, they were urgent, almost desperate. They spoke of promises and warnings. I thought I heard my own name called, though I knew no one else was there. I tried to leave the next morning, but the forest had other plans. Trails I had walked clearly were blocked by fallen trees, brush, and sudden bogs I hadn't noticed before. It was like the woods were shifting, closing in on me. Over the next week, the sightings increased. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of the woman in the distance, they watching from behind trees or near the creek. I found more symbols, sometimes carved into stones, sometimes drawn in mud. The whispers became voices, calling me to come closer, to stay. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridges, I returned to the ruins and found a circle of stones arranged carefully. Inside it lay a small bundle wrapped in cloth. When I unwrapped it, I found a faded photograph of a family. A man, woman, and 2 children, standing in front of the very cabin I'd been investigating. The photo was old, torn at the edges, and on the back was written, in shaky handwriting, "Protect the Hollow." I pocketed the photo and hurried back to camp, feeling eyes on my back the entire way. That night, the whispers turned into screams, high-pitched, anguished, as if the forest itself was crying out. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and tried to drown it out, but the voices were relentless. At dawn, I found the cabin completely different. Where there had been ruins the night before, now stood a fully intact cabin, smoke curling from the chimney. The windows were lit from within by a warm firelight. I hesitated, then knocked on the door. No answer. I pushed it open slowly. Inside was a scene frozen in time, old wooden furniture, a rocking chair, a hearth with a fire still burning, and on the table a meal half eaten. I could hear whispers again, but now they seemed sad, pleading. Then from the corner the woman appeared again. This time she spoke. "Help us," she said. "Break the curse." I asked her what curse. She told me about the Preston family, how Eli had tried to protect the Hollow with his strange rites, but had made a terrible mistake. A dark spirit was bound to the land, feeding on grief and fear, whispering lies to drive people mad. The family had died trapped inside their own home, unable to escape the evil they had summoned. She said only someone who understood the land and the old ways could set them free, someone with the blood of the mountains in their veins. I didn't know what to say. She handed me the satchel Eli had carried, the one I'd heard about but never seen. Inside were herbs, small bones, and a knife with runes etched on the blade. "Perform the cleansing at midnight," she said. "Burn the circle. Speak the words of old." I nodded, though fear clutched my chest. At midnight, I returned to the clearing, the satchel heavy in my pack. The whispers surrounded me, cold and bitter. I laid out the herbs, traced the symbols, and lit the circle on fire. The flames roared, bright blue and green, casting strange shadows that writhed like living things. I spoke the words I had learned from the satchel's notes, a chant in Cherokee and English, a plea for forgiveness and release. The fire flared, and the screams cut off suddenly, replaced by a heavy silence. The woman appeared one last time, smiling softly. "Thank you." Then she vanished, and the forest felt different, lighter, open. I stayed until dawn, watching as the first light filtered through the trees, birds singing again as if waking from a long nightmare. After that summer, I left the Forest Service. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of those mountains, that the woods had shared their secrets with me, but warned me to never forget. Years later, when I return to visit family in the foothills, I still drive past the old hollow. The cabin ruins are gone, replaced by trees that sway gently in the breeze. Sometimes on quiet nights, I think I hear whispers again, but this time they're soft, almost like a thank you. The mountains keep their secrets, but they also keep their peace. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
The Appalachian Mountains stretch out like a spine through the eastern United States, a place where time seems to slow and old secrets cling to the hills like moss on trees. I didn't believe in ghosts before I went there, not really. I'd heard the stories, sure, everyone from the locals had them. Strange noises, ghostly figures, unexplained disappearances. But I figured they were just legends, myths told to scare tourists or pass down old history in a dramatic way. That changed the summer I went to visit my grandfather's childhood home, a weathered log cabin tucked away in a remote part of the mountains in eastern Kentucky. Grandpa had passed away a few years earlier, and the family had inherited the cabin. It was mostly forgotten, left to the elements, but my parents insisted I go and take a look, maybe fix it up or just spend some time away from the city. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky a wash of orange and pink as the sun dipped behind the trees. The cabin sat on a small clearing surrounded by thick forest, the kind of dense woods where sunlight barely touched the ground. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and there was a quiet stillness that felt different from the usual forest sounds I was used to. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, just silence. I unlocked the heavy door and stepped inside. The air was stale, dust floating in the shafts of fading light. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace and a few pieces of old furniture covered in sheets. I spent the next hour pulling everything back to see what I had. Old photographs, a rusty cast-iron stove, a stack of books yellowed with age. As night fell, I built a fire in the hearth and sat by it with a notebook, writing down the stories Grandpa had told me over the years. He spoke of the mountains like they were alive, with spirits and forces beyond understanding. His favorite story was about the woman in the woods, a ghost said to roam the forest near the cabin. According to Grandpa, she was a young woman named Eliza who had lived in the mountains during the late 1800s. Eliza had fallen in love with a local man, but their families disapproved, and she was forced to marry someone else. Heartbroken, she wandered into the woods one night and never came back. Since then, people claim to see her ghost wandering the trees, searching for her lost love. I laughed at the story then. Ghosts were stories, not reality. That night, I slept fitfully. The cabin was colder than I expected, and the wind whispered through the cracks in the walls. Around 2 a.m., I was awakened by a faint sound, a tapping, like someone knocking on wood. I sat up, listening hard, but it stopped. I told myself it was the wind or an animal. The next day, I went exploring. The forest was thick with ferns and ancient trees, and the trail near the cabin led down to a small creek. As I walked, I found a circle of stones near a giant oak tree, arranged as if marking something. I bent down and saw faded carvings on one stone, initials, dates, and symbols I didn't recognize. The air around it felt heavy, almost oppressive. That evening, back at the cabin, the tapping started again, louder this time, coming from the front door. I got up to check, but found nothing outside except shadows dancing in the moonlight. Over the next few days, strange things happened. Doors would creak open on their own. I heard footsteps on the porch when no one was there. Once I thought I saw a pale figure standing in the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, but the unease grew. One night, as I sat by the fire, I found an old journal tucked behind a loose stone in the fireplace. The pages were fragile but legible. It belonged to a man named Thomas, who had lived in the cabin around 1890. His entries started normal enough, notes on weather, hunting, and family. But then they changed. He wrote about hearing tapping on the windows at night, about seeing a woman in a white dress standing by the trees, her eyes hollow and sad. He said she never spoke, but that her presence filled him with dread. The last entries were frantic, mentioning whispers in the dark and shadows that moved on their own. The final page was stained and torn with a hurried note. She watches from the woods, waiting to claim what was lost. Stay inside, or she will take you too. I felt a chill run down my spine. That night, the tapping returned, relentless and insistent. It moved from window to window, then to the walls. I tried to ignore it, but the noise was maddening. Suddenly, the fire flickered and died. The room plunged into darkness. In the blackness, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching from the doorway. I grabbed a flashlight, but the batteries were dead. My heart pounded as I scrambled to find matches. When I lit a candle, the room looked empty, but I could feel the presence, something cold and sorrowful. I called out, "Eliza? If you're here, what do you want?" The tapping stopped. Then came a whisper, barely audible, like a breeze through the leaves. "Help me." The candle flickered violently, and a shadow moved across the wall. A woman in white, eyes empty, reaching toward me with trembling hands. I stumbled back, knocking over the candle, plunging the cabin into darkness again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed my things and left the cabin, locking the door behind me. As I drove down the mountain road, I looked back once and saw a figure standing at the cabin's porch, a woman in a white dress, watching me leave with hollow eyes. I never went back. Years later, I still think about that summer, about the tapping, the whispers, and the ghost who waited in the woods. Some say the Appalachian Mountains hold memories of those who never left, souls bound to the land by heartbreak and loss. I believe them now. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The first time I drove into the Appalachian Mountains, it was late October. The trees were just starting to blaze in their autumn colors, fiery reds, burnt oranges, and golden yellows stretching out for miles. I was a city kid, born and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, with little reason to be interested in anything rural beyond the occasional camping trip or hiking trail. But after a decade working in IT, the stress was grinding me down, and I craved something simpler, quieter. That's how I ended up agreeing to house sit for an old family friend, a recluse named Jeb who lived miles off any paved road near a small town called Spruce Pine. Jeb's place was a ramshackle cabin built from rough-cut timber and covered in decades of moss and lichen. It sat near a ridge that overlooked a patchwork of hills and hollers. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and pine sap. My phone had no signal once I turned off the highway. No internet, no radio, no television. Nothing but the sounds of the forest and a silence so thick it pressed against my skin. On my first night, I felt the kind of isolation that seeps deep into your bones. The cabin creaked as the wind shifted through the trees. I heard the whistle of a distant train, echoing faintly through the hollers, and the occasional hoot of an owl. But beneath it all, there was something else. A faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was rain, but the sky was clear, and I quickly realized the tapping was coming from inside the cabin, from the wall beside my bed. I pressed my ear against the rough wood paneling, heart thudding. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a woodpecker, and tried to sleep. The next day, I explored the property. A narrow trail wound down through thick undergrowth to a creek where the water ran clear and cold. The locals had warned me about going out after dark, but I laughed it off. I wasn't superstitious. I was a rational person. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. It moved from the wall to the ceiling above my head. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed onto the cabin's small loft, where old hunting trophies and dusty crates sat forgotten. In the dim beam, I saw scratch marks gouged into the wooden beams, long, deep lines as if claws had scraped the wood. But there were no animals that big around here. I shivered and climbed down. I was halfway through the week when things took a turn for the worse. The dreams started that night. At first, they were vague, Images of a woman in a faded dress standing in the misty woods, her face always turned away. Then the dreams grew darker. The woman would call out to me in a voice that sounded both distant and urgent. I'd follow her through the trees, deeper into the mountain fog, until I reached a small clearing where an old, rotting grave marker stood, half buried under moss and fallen leaves. I woke each time with a cold sweat, heart pounding, the woman's voice echoing in my mind. On the fourth night, I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, pacing near the cabin's perimeter. I grabbed a flashlight and peered out into the dark. The beam caught a figure standing near the tree line, a woman, thin and pale, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress stained with dirt. Her long black hair hung over her face. When she turned toward me, her eyes were hollow pits. I dropped the flashlight in shock. When I looked back, she was gone. Over the next few days, I tried to leave, but my truck wouldn't start. The battery was fine, but the engine refused to turn over. Each attempt ended with a grinding sound and then silence. I was trapped. I started to notice things changing in the cabin. Objects moved places overnight. A chair that had been by the fireplace would be in the kitchen the next morning. My food went missing. When I checked the pantry, I found handfuls of dirt mixed in with the cans. One afternoon, I hiked back to the clearing from my dreams. The grave marker was real, a weathered wooden cross with initials carved deep, ME 1893. The ground was soft and uneven, like a recent burial. I brushed away the moss and leaves, uncovering a small, rusted locket buried near the base. Inside the locket was a faded photograph of a young girl no older than 10. Her eyes seemed to follow me. I took the locket with me, hoping it would give me some answers. Instead, it made the dreams worse. That night, the woman came to me again, but this time she spoke clearly. "Find me," she whispered. "Set me free." I tried to call Ellie, Jeb's niece, for help. She answered on the third ring. "Don't stay there," she said, voice trembling. "The cabin's been empty since my family left. They say it's cursed." "What do you mean?" I asked. Ellie told me the story of Mary Ellen, a girl who'd lived in the cabin in the late 1800s. She died young, some said murdered, others said lost to the mountain's wilds. Her restless spirit was said to haunt the woods, looking for someone to help her find peace. That night, I couldn't sleep. The tapping grew frantic, pounding on the walls and ceiling. The temperature dropped so low my breath fogged the air. I went outside, carrying the locket and a small shovel from the cabin. The clearing was bathed in moonlight. I started digging near the grave marker, the earth soft and damp beneath my hands. After a few minutes, my shovel struck something hard, a small wooden box, locked and rotted. I pried it open, revealing old letters and a rusted knife stained with dark spots. As I lifted the knife, a cold hand clamped onto my wrist. I spun around, but no one was there. The forest seemed to close in, the trees whispering. Suddenly, the woman appeared before me, her eyes filled with sadness. "Thank you," she said. "Now bury me properly." I wrapped the letters and knife back in cloth and dug a deeper hole. I laid the box inside, covered it with earth, and pressed the locket into the dirt. The tapping stopped, the air warmed, and for the first time in days, I slept. The next morning, the sun filtered softly through the trees. My truck started on the first try. As I drove away from the cabin, I glanced back once. In the window, a faint silhouette of a woman stood watching me go, but she was smiling. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The Appalachian Mountains have a way of swallowing you whole, of making you feel like just another whisper in their ancient forests. I learned that the hard way during the summer I spent working at the old Cranberry Hollow logging camp. It was the kind of place locals barely spoke about, where the trees seemed to lean in closer and the fog crept down from the ridges like a slow, suffocating breath. I'd grown up hearing the stories, half-truths and rumors from my grandfather about strange lights, disappearing hikers, and voices calling out in the night. But I was young and stubborn, convinced that the mountains only kept the past in their silence and the wind in their leaves. When I got the job at Cranberry Hollow, I thought it was an adventure, a chance to escape the small-town grind and prove myself. I wasn't prepared for what I found. The camp sat in a narrow valley, hemmed in by thick stands of hemlock and pine. The cabins were old, some nearly rotting through, and the main lodge was a hulking relic of timber and rusted nails. The logging company was just starting to bring the area back to life. but much of the equipment was relics of a bygone era, scattered around like forgotten bones. The first few days passed in a blur of sweat and hard labor, clearing trails, hauling logs, fixing fences, nothing I hadn't done before. But when night fell, the mountains changed. The forest became a different beast, darker and quieter, and the fog seeped in so thick it was like walking underwater. Joe was the oldest man on site, maybe in his late 50s, but with eyes that had seen too much. He had the sort of quiet voice that didn't invite questions, but he took me aside one evening by the campfire and told me about the Hollow Man. Folks around here don't talk about it much, he said, poking at the fire. But Cranberry Hollow's been cursed. Back in the 20s, a logging crew disturbed an old burial ground up the ridge. Ever since, the Hollow Man's been walking these woods. I laughed it off then, ghost stories for superstitious mountain folk. But Joe's eyes were serious, and the way he said Hollow Man made me feel the words hung heavy in the air. People disappear, Joe went on. Hear voices in the mist calling their names, footsteps behind them when no one's there. You don't want to meet the Hollow Man. He's not a friendly spirit. The very next night, I thought Joe was pulling my leg. I was walking back to the cabin from the outhouse when the fog rolled in like a living wall. Suddenly, I heard it. A whisper, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. Mark, my name, clear as day. I froze, scanning the trees, but the only movement was the fog swirling in the moonlight. My heart pounded, and I called out, "Joe, you out here?" No answer. I hurried back, every crack of a twig snapping loud in the silence. When I got to the cabin, the door slammed shut behind me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I chalked it up to the wind and tried to get some sleep, but the image of those empty woods stayed with me. Over the following days, the weirdness escalated. Tools went missing and turned up in places that made no sense, wedged in tree branches, buried in the dirt by the riverbank. I heard footsteps circling the cabin at night, but when I peered outside, there was nothing but fog and shadows. One night, the fire I'd built in the hearth flared suddenly, casting wild, dancing shadows before dying out completely. The room plunged into darkness so thick it felt suffocating. I could swear I heard breathing just behind me. "Leave," a voice rasped. I spun around, but no one was there. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, Joe was grim when I told him. "The Hollow Man's angry," he said quietly. "You stirred things up by being out late and poking around the woods." I tried to laugh it off, but inside a cold knot of fear had formed. Curious and desperate to understand, I started digging through old records in the town library. What I found was a chilling story. In the early 1920s, a logging crew had cleared a massive swath of forest near Cranberry Hollow. In their greed, they had cut down sacred trees, disturbing a burial site of the Cherokee who once lived in the region. The leader of that crew, a man named Samuel Grayson, had died mysteriously. Some said he went mad and disappeared into the woods. Others whispered he was taken by the spirit guardians. After his disappearance, workers reported strange occurrences. Phantom axes swinging in the dark, shadows moving between trees, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the mist. Eventually, the company abandoned the camp. As I read those accounts, a sense of dread settled deeper. That night, I was restless. The wind outside sounded like mournful wails. When I stepped outside, the fog had thickened, swirling low like smoke. Then I saw it, faint, flickering lights weaving through the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I called out, "Who's there?" No reply, but the lights danced closer, bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps. I followed, entranced, deeper into the forest. The fog clung to me like a living thing. Suddenly the lights vanished, leaving me in utter darkness. A cold hand seemed to brush my shoulder. I spun, heart in my throat, but there was no one. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall and gaunt, dressed in threadbare logging clothes. His eyes were empty pits, and his mouth moved, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, panic rising. "Leave this place," he whispered, voice hollow and broken. I ran without looking back, bursting into the camp and slamming the door behind me. The rest of the night, I heard that voice, faint and distant, calling my name over and over, echoing off the mountains. By morning, the others noticed I looked pale and shaken. Joe sat me down. "There's a way to end it," he said. "You have to find the old burial ground and make things right." He gave me an old map, faded and torn, marking a spot deep in the forest. The journal I'd found earlier had hinted at this place, but never named it. The next day, armed with a flashlight, some offerings, herbs, coins, and a small carved wooden figure and Joe's map, I ventured into the woods alone. The trail was barely visible, tangled with roots and dead branches. The air was thick and still. After hours of hiking, I reached a clearing surrounded by ancient stones, moss-covered and cracked. In the center was a shallow grave, marked by a rusted axe embedded in the earth. Kneeling, I placed the offerings on the ground and spoke aloud. I ask forgiveness for disturbing your resting place. May you find peace, and may these mountains heal. The wind picked up suddenly, swirling leaves around me like a cyclone. For a moment, I felt an overwhelming sadness wash over me, like the weight of 1,000 lost souls. Then, a figure appeared before me, the Hollow Man. But this time, he was not menacing. His face was weary, almost grateful. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice fading like mist. The forest seemed to exhale, the fog lifting, and for the first time in weeks, the silence was peaceful. I returned to camp feeling lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. That summer taught me that the mountains remember. They carry the past in their roots and their stones. And some spirits linger, bound by pain and anger, until someone listens. I never forgot the Hollow Man, and though I left Cranberry Hollow behind, I still hear the wind whisper through the Appalachian pines, carrying a warning and a hope. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The Appalachian Mountains stretch for miles, ancient, vast, and wrapped in a mist that clings to the hollows and ridges like a secret. For those who grew up there, the mountains aren't just geography. They're a living, breathing presence, full of stories and memories, some darker than others. I grew up in a small town nestled in the foothills of the Appalachians, where every generation carried stories of strange sightings, voices on the wind, and shadows that moved just beyond the campfire glow. When I was a teenager, I didn't believe much of it. Ghost stories were for scaring kids, and the mountains were just home, beautiful, and wild. But everything changed the summer I went to work at an old logging camp, deep in the mountains, far from cell service and electricity. That summer, I learned that some stories aren't just stories, they're warnings. The camp was called Maple Hollow, named for the dense maple trees that shaded the area. It was a collection of weathered cabins and makeshift structures built decades ago when logging was the main livelihood for the people in the region. The camp had long been abandoned, but a small company was trying to revive logging in the area, and I was hired to help with trail maintenance and basic groundskeeping. The first few days felt like a dream. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. But as night fell, something shifted. I shared a cabin with an older man named Joe, who had lived his whole life in the mountains and knew every twist of every trail. Over dinner, he told me about the history of Maple Hollow and warned me about the Hollow Man. "You ever hear about him?" Joe asked, voice low. "They say he's the ghost of a logger who got lost in these woods decades ago. Some say he was cursed for cutting too deep, too fast. Others say he was a man who died with unfinished business, always wandering, watching." I laughed it off, but Joe's eyes were serious. "If you're out after dark and hear footsteps that don't match your own or a voice calling your name from the trees, don't answer. Just keep moving." The first week passed without incident. We worked hard, clearing trails and setting up equipment. At night, the forest was dark and quiet, except for the usual sounds. But one evening, as I was heading back to the cabin alone after checking a fallen tree, I heard it. A faint whispering, like someone calling my name just beyond the tree line. I stopped, heart pounding, and called out, "Hello? Joe? Anyone?" Only silence answered. But the feeling didn't leave me. The shadows seemed to press closer, and the wind carried that faint voice again, almost pleading. I hurried back, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks. Joe gave me a knowing look the next day, but didn't press. Then strange things started happening. Tools would go missing, only to be found in strange places, like the top of a tall pine or buried in the dirt. I'd hear footsteps circling the cabin at night, slow and deliberate, but when I looked outside, no one was there. One night, the fire I'd built to keep warm suddenly flared wildly, then died out, leaving me shivering in the dark. Joe said it was the Hollow Man, restless and angry, One afternoon, I decided to explore the old logging trails deeper into the forest, looking for a better route. As I walked, the trees grew taller and closer, the sunlight barely reaching the ground. I came across an old clearing with rusted equipment, half swallowed by moss and vines. At the center was a large oak tree, its bark scarred and blackened, as if by fire. Near the base of the tree, I spotted something unusual, a carving. It looked like a rough outline of a man surrounded by strange symbols. I traced the symbols with my fingers, feeling a coldness seep through my skin. Suddenly, I heard a voice behind me, low and gravelly. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, but no one was there. From that moment on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, sometimes calling my name, sometimes warning me to leave. The feeling of being watched never left. One night after the others had gone to bed, I heard footsteps again, this time right outside the cabin. I opened the door slowly and saw a figure standing at the edge of the firelight, a tall man in old-fashioned logging clothes, face obscured by shadows. "Who are you?" I asked, voice trembling. The figure didn't answer, just lifted a hand and pointed toward the forest. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. The next day, I asked Joe about the carving. His face went pale. "That's the mark of the Hollow Man," he said. "It's a warning from the old loggers, symbols meant to keep the spirit bound. But if they're disturbed, well, bad things happen." I tried to dismiss it, but the feeling of dread stayed with me. As the days passed, the hauntings escalated. I found footprints in the dirt around the cabin that vanished without a trace. Doors slammed on their own. At night, cold fingers seemed to brush against my skin. One evening, I heard a voice whisper right in my ear, "Leave, before it's too late." Despite the fear, I refused to quit. I wanted to prove to myself this was all nonsense. One afternoon, while clearing a fallen tree near the old oak, I heard a scream. A woman's scream, raw and terrified. I ran toward the sound, but found only silence and the rustling of leaves. Then I saw it. Footprints in the mud leading away from the clearing, but no sign of who or what had made them. That night, sleep was impossible. Shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the whispers turned into agonized wails. At the edge of dawn, I heard a knock at the cabin door. I opened it to find no one, but on the porch lay a bundle wrapped in tattered cloth. Inside was a faded journal belonging to a logger named Samuel Harper, dated 1912. I read by the firelight, Samuel's handwriting shaky, filled with fear. He wrote about a logging crew that had disturbed a sacred burial ground deep in the forest. After that, the men were haunted by a vengeful spirit, the Hollow Man, who cursed them one by one. Samuel described how he'd tried to appease the spirit with offerings and carvings, but feared it was too late. As I read, the wind picked up outside, carrying the sound of distant footsteps. The next days passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. I started hearing voices whispering warnings, not just in the night, but all day. The forest around Maple Hollow felt alive with menace, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. One evening, I found Joe sitting outside the cabin, staring into the fire. "You have to finish what Samuel started," he said quietly. "There's a way to lay the Hollow Man to rest. You need to find the burial ground, make the offerings, and ask for forgiveness." I wasn't sure I believed him, but the fear had grown too strong to ignore. Guided by the journal, I set out early the next morning. The trail was rough and overgrown, twisting deeper into the heart of the forest. Hours passed as I pushed through underbrush until finally I reached a small clearing surrounded by ancient stones. In the center was a shallow grave, marked with a broken axe and a wreath of dried flowers. I knelt and placed the offerings Samuel had described: coins, herbs, a carved wooden figure. Then I spoke aloud, asking forgiveness for disturbing the resting place and promising respect for the land and its spirits. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the wind stilled and the forest fell into an eerie silence. Suddenly I felt a presence beside me, a warmth like a hand resting on my shoulder. I looked up to see the outline of a man, no longer a shadow but a gentle figure with kind eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. "You have freed us." The figure faded and the forest seemed to breathe again. When I returned to Maple Hollow, the oppressive feeling was gone. The whispers ceased, the shadows retreated, and the forest was peaceful. I left the mountains soon after, but the memory stayed with me, a reminder that some places carry the weight of the past, and some spirits need our respect to find peace. I never forgot the Hollow Man or the lessons of those ancient woods, and every time the wind rustles through the leaves back home, I listen closely, hoping to hear only the song of the mountains. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
The Appalachian Mountains have a way of swallowing you whole. When I first got the call from my Uncle Tom, I didn't think much of it. "Come up here and check on the cabin," he said. "It's been empty a while." I'd been meaning to get away from the city, so I figured, why not? A week in the mountains might do me good. The cabin sat about 20 miles off the main highway, past a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest. I drove my beat-up pickup as far as I could, then hiked the rest of the way carrying a duffel bag. The air was cool and smelled like pine and moss. There was a stillness there I hadn't felt in years, a quiet that settled deep into your bones. The cabin was older than I expected, built from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney blackened from years of use. It looked abandoned but sturdy enough. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and inside was a thick layer of dust. There was a wood stove in the corner and a simple table with 2 chairs. I found a box of matches and some old canned food in the kitchen, enough to get me through the night. That first evening, I made a fire and sat back with a bottle of whiskey. The woods outside were dense and dark, and the wind whispered through the trees like voices. I shrugged it off as imagination, but that night I heard it. A tapping, gentle at first, then growing louder. 3 knocks, steady and deliberate, coming from the front door. I froze. The door was locked, and I was alone. When I mustered the courage to check, there was no one there, only the heavy fog curling along the ground and the dense forest beyond. I told myself it was a branch tapping against the wood, or maybe an animal. But the tapping didn't stop. It moved to the windows, always 3 knocks, then silence. The next day I explored the surrounding area. The forest was thick, full of ancient trees and tangled underbrush. About a mile from the cabin, I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center was a circle of stones, roughly arranged, with a small wooden effigy nailed to a tree. The figure was crudely carved, a faceless woman with long hair carved into the wood. I took a picture and headed back, feeling uneasy. When I got to the cabin, I found a worn, leather-bound journal sitting on the table. It hadn't been there before. Flipping through it, I saw it belonged to a man named Silas, who'd lived there more than 100 years ago. His entries began like any frontier journal, weather reports, hunting notes, crop updates. But then his writing shifted, becoming darker. He wrote of hearing tapping at his windows at night, of a woman dressed in white who wandered the woods, her face hidden in shadows. Silas claimed she never spoke but stared at him with sorrowful eyes. One entry stood out. April 22nd, 1887. She came again tonight, standing by the edge of the clearing. I left bread and salt for her, as my grandmother taught me. The tapping stopped, but the feeling remains, a weight pressing on my chest. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. It moved from the windows to the walls, then to the ceiling. I felt something brush against my arm as I sat by the fire. When I turned, there was nothing but the flickering shadows. Sleep evaded me. Around 3 a.m., I heard soft crying outside near the clearing. Grabbing my flashlight and a hunting knife, I stepped into the cold night. The forest was alive with eerie sounds, rustling leaves, distant hoots, the crackle of twigs. I followed the crying toward the clearing. When I reached the stones, the crying stopped abruptly. The wooden effigy seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the trees, extinguishing my flashlight. In the pitch black, I heard footsteps approaching slowly. "Who's there?" I shouted, heart pounding. Silence, then a whisper. "Help me." I froze, then the temperature dropped so sharply I could see my breath. A pale figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, a woman in a flowing white dress, her hair long and tangled, eyes empty but filled with sorrow. She stepped closer, mouth opening to speak, but only silence came. I backed away slowly, then turned and ran back to the cabin, the tapping following me all the way. Over the next days, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The journal hinted at a tragic story, a woman named Mary who died in the woods after her lover abandoned her. The locals had kept her memory alive with rituals at the stone circle, offerings to keep her spirit at peace, but something had gone wrong. The tapping was a warning, a plea. On my last night, the tapping was relentless, pounding on the door, the windows, the walls. I sat with my back to the fireplace, clutching the journal. Then, in the silence between knocks, I heard a voice whispering my name. I looked up to see the woman in white standing inside the cabin, her eyes hollow, lips parted as if to speak. I didn't wait to hear her words. I grabbed my pack and ran into the night, never looking back. I still hear the tapping sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, in the rustling wind. The mountains hold their secrets tightly, but some are desperate to be heard. Story the end.
Story number 11.
It started with a call from my cousin Jacob, the kind of call that only comes once or twice in a lifetime, the kind that doesn't feel right from the beginning. He'd inherited a cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains from a great uncle neither of us had ever met. The land had been in the family for generations, untouched, almost forgotten. He said it felt like something out of a dream. The air was cleaner, colder, quieter, that kind of silence that doesn't exist in towns or cities, the kind that presses into your ears until you hear your own heartbeat. Jacob wanted help fixing it up, said the roof leaked and the fireplace was choked with soot. The road up there wasn't maintained, so you'd need four-wheel drive and nerves of steel. I hesitated, told him I'd think about it, but 2 days later, I packed my bag. My job had gone remote, my girlfriend had left a month before, and I figured some time in the wilderness might clear the fog in my head. The drive took 6 hours, most of it through towns that looked like they hadn't changed since the 1950s. Once I got into the mountains, cell service vanished. I followed his directions through switchbacks and gravel roads until I reached a rusted iron gate. It squealed when I opened it, and the trees on either side formed a tunnel of shadows as I drove through. I felt like I was leaving the world behind. Jacob's truck was already there, parked in front of the cabin. It was a squat, 2-story thing with green paint peeling from the sides, wrapped in dense woods and low fog. He came out smiling, holding a beer in one hand and waving with the other. "Place has got character," he said. Inside, it smelled like wood rot and time. There were old family photos on the walls, all black and white, all staring straight ahead with the kind of solemn expressions you only see in the early 1900s. There were oil lamps instead of bulbs, and a wood-burning stove in the kitchen that looked like it hadn't been used in 50 years. We spent the first 2 days clearing out junk. There were trunks full of letters, records, and tools, and one entire room stacked floor to ceiling with books. Most were about the mountains, flora, fauna, old folklore. One night, Jacob showed me a strange journal he found under a loose board in the floor. The leather cover was cracked, the pages brittle, the handwriting was neat, old-fashioned cursive. It belonged to someone named Elijah Ballard. The entries started off normal, talking about planting crops, the weather, hunting trips, but then they got off. April 14th, 1912. Heard the tapping again near the tree line. Same rhythm as before. Thought it was a woodpecker, but it came at night. May 3rd, 1912. Saw her again. Pale dress, no feet, just floating. Wouldn't come near the cabin, just stood between the trees. Watching. Always watching. May 9th, 1912. Left offerings again. Bread, salt, bit of rabbit I shot. The forest was quiet for 2 nights after, but now the tapping's back. Closer this time. Jacob laughed it off. Backwoods superstition. Guy probably drank too much moonshine. Still, he kept reading. Every night after dinner, he'd go through more of it, flashlight in hand, eyes fixed to the pages. After a while, he started sleeping with the journal under his pillow. By the 5th night, something changed. It started with sounds, soft, like something brushing against the cabin. I heard it from the loft where I slept. I leaned out over the railing and whispered down to Jacob, "You hear that?" He didn't respond, just turned a page. Then there was a knock, 3 slow knocks at the back door. I sat up straight, heart in my throat. Jacob finally looked up. We stared at each other for a second, then both got up and walked to the door. The handle was cold. I opened it fast, like ripping off a bandage. Nothing, just trees. Mist. No tracks. "I locked the gate," I said. "No one should be up here." Jacob just nodded and closed the door. The next day, we hiked around the property looking for signs of animals or people. The ground was damp, easy to track in, but we didn't find anything. Not until we circled back near the northern edge of the property. That's when we saw it, a circle of stones. Not large, maybe 6 feet wide, but perfectly shaped. In the middle was a small wooden totem, carved roughly into the shape of a person with no eyes and a gaping mouth. It had twine around its neck, soaked through with something dark and dried. Jacob's face went pale. "Wasn't here before," he muttered. "We didn't touch it. We just walked away." That night, the tapping came back. Not on the walls this time. On the windows. First the kitchen, then the bedroom, then the loft. Always 3 knocks, always followed by silence. We didn't sleep. At 3:13 a.m., the front door creaked open. Not slammed, not burst in, just creaked. I jumped up and grabbed the axe we'd been using to chop wood. Jacob stood next to me, white as a sheet. We both stepped toward the door. It was wide open, nothing outside, just fog and cold air leaking in. We checked every inch of the house, all locked, all secure. That door had been locked too. I know it had. I locked it myself. We didn't talk much the next day. Jacob just kept reading the journal. When I asked what it said, he waved me off. That evening, I noticed he hadn't eaten. Just sat in the living room, muttering under his breath. "Jacob?" He looked up, eyes bloodshot. "They're older than the trees," he said. "Older than bones. She just wants peace." "Who?" He stared at me. Elijah called her the weeping one. He said she cries when she can't get in. I told him he needed sleep. Told him he was freaking himself out. But that night, I heard him get up and walk outside. I followed, barefoot and freezing. He was standing at the edge of the woods facing that stone circle. His arms were raised. I called out to him. He turned slowly and said, "She's listening now. We shouldn't have come here." The next morning, he was gone. No note. No tracks. Just gone. I searched for 3 days. Left food at the edge of the woods, yelled his name until my throat was raw. I called for help with a satellite phone we kept for emergencies. When the Rangers came, I told them the truth. Most of it. They searched for 2 more days before giving up. No sign of him. No sign of struggle. They told me to pack up and leave. I did. But I couldn't stop thinking about the journal. I couldn't leave without it. I went back in that night, grabbed it from under Jacob's pillow. When I opened it again, the last page had new writing. Fresh ink. I walked into the forest. I walked into her mouth. She took my name and stitched it into the wind. I dropped the book and ran. Didn't look back. I stayed with my sister in Tennessee for a while, told myself it was trauma, stress, a breakdown. But then the journal showed up on my porch one morning, wrapped in twine, smelling like dirt and smoke. I burned it in her fireplace. 2 nights later, I heard the tapping on her window. 3 slow knocks. I didn't tell her. She wouldn't believe me. I said I was going for a drive and never went back. It's been 3 years now. I move every few months. Never sleep in the same place twice in a row. The tapping still comes. Sometimes on hotel doors, sometimes on car windows. Sometimes it's just her face in the corner of my eye, pale and silent, watching from the tree line. I don't know what she is or what she wants, but I know this. Somewhere in those mountains, something old woke up the moment we walked into that cabin, and it remembers me. Story the end.
Story number 12.
I took the job because it seemed like the kind of opportunity people in my line of work couldn't afford to pass up. I'd been a backcountry ranger for over a decade, hopping from park to park, always seasonal, always waiting for that elusive permanent placement. When the call came about a 6-month position in the Appalachian Mountains, I didn't even hesitate. The park wasn't officially open to the public. Some kind of restoration project was underway, and they needed someone to keep an eye on the trails, log unusual activity, make sure poachers or curious hikers didn't trespass. The pay was good. Too good, honestly. The ranger station was a 30-minute drive from the nearest paved road and another 2 hours from anything resembling a town. I stocked up on groceries and supplies before making the drive in. The station itself was an old log cabin, nestled deep into the hills. There were no neighbors, no passing cars, no cell reception, just woods, endless woods in all directions. Towering oaks, pines so tall you could barely see their tops, and fog that hung heavy even in the daylight. The isolation didn't bother me. I'd lived for months at a time with nothing but my thoughts and the occasional bear to keep me company. But there was something about these mountains that felt different from the moment I stepped out of the truck. The air was heavy, like it was hiding something. And the silence, it wasn't peaceful. It pressed down on you, thick and aware, like the forest was listening. The first week passed uneventfully. I hiked the trails, checked the cameras, made notes about erosion, fallen trees, things that might need attention once the restoration team came through. A couple of times I found deer carcasses picked clean in ways that didn't sit right. No tracks, no blood trails, just bones arranged in oddly neat circles. I figured it was local hunters trying to spook trespassers. It worked. One morning I woke up to find a pile of rocks stacked neatly on the porch steps. 7 of them, each a little larger than the one below. They hadn't been there the night before. I looked for footprints, signs of animals or people. Nothing. Just the rocks. I kicked them off the steps and figured it was a prank from someone who knew the area better than I did. The next night, I was woken by a sound that didn't belong. I couldn't place it at first. It was quiet, high-pitched, almost like humming. I turned off the lantern and stepped out onto the porch. The woods were blanketed in fog so thick I could barely see the end of the porch. But the sound was louder now, and it was definitely humming. Not a tune I recognized, but rhythmic. Human. It was coming from the trees. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice sounding small against the weight of the forest. The humming stopped. I waited, flashlight in hand, heart thudding like a drumbeat. Nothing moved. The silence swallowed the air again. I stood there for what felt like 10 minutes before backing inside and locking the door. The next morning, more rocks, this time on the roof, a small pile stacked right above the door. I found another in the woods near the station, and another beside the old trail marker a mile out. All of them identical, 7 rocks, always stacked. I radioed into the ranger headquarters, told them I thought someone was screwing around out here. "Locals stay away from that section," the voice crackled back. "You sure it's not just your imagination?" "I'm sure," I said. "There's someone out here." "Then don't engage," the dispatcher replied. "Log it. Stay safe. We'll send someone out next supply run." That was 3 days away. That night I didn't sleep. The humming returned, but this time there were voices underneath it. Whispers. They drifted just outside the cabin, low and persistent. I heard my name, not shouted, just spoken softly like someone was crouched right beneath the window. "Tom." I didn't go outside. The next day I hiked the East Ridge, thinking maybe I'd find signs of a camp. About 5 miles in, I stumbled across an old cemetery, not marked on any of my maps, overgrown and half swallowed by underbrush. Most of the stones were so worn I couldn't read them, but a few names still stood out. One said, Caleb Hargrove, 1889 to 1909. Another, Sarah Hargrove, 1892 to 1910. A whole row of Hargroves, all dead young. At the edge of the clearing was a stone marker taller than the rest. No name, no dates. Just a circle etched deeply into the face with a triangle inside. It looked like it had been carved by hand, rough, angry marks like someone had chiseled it in a frenzy. I didn't like being there. I left fast, made a note of the GPS coordinates, and didn't look back until I was inside the station again. That night, I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. I'd locked it. I know I did. I grabbed the rifle from above the fireplace and crept out of bed, barefoot, heart hammering. The door was swinging open slowly, creaking on the hinges. Fog was curling in across the floor like smoke. I stepped forward, kicked the door shut, and locked it again. Then I turned and froze. All across the wooden floor of the cabin were muddy footprints. Bare feet. Small, child-sized. They led from the door to the hallway and vanished at the threshold of the bedroom. I slept with the rifle on my chest. The next morning I called in again. No answer. The radio just buzzed with static. I tried the backup unit. Same thing. I climbed to the lookout tower a mile up the ridge and tried again. Nothing. On the way back down, I found something hanging from the trees. Dozens of dolls, homemade, primitive. Twigs and cloth, some with button eyes, others with faces stitched in red thread. They swung gently in the wind, hundreds of them across the canopy like grotesque fruit. One of them had my name sewn into the chest. Tom. I ran. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch with the rifle across my knees, eyes on the tree line. The humming came back, closer now, louder. I saw figures between the trunks, short, hunched, moving with impossible speed. They never got closer than the clearing, but they were there, watching. I could feel it. Around 3 a.m. the cabin shook, just once like something massive had slammed into the side of it. I raced outside but saw nothing. Then I looked up. On the roof, crouched low, was a shape. It looked like a child, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted too far, like its neck had been snapped. It was crawling across the roof, slowly, deliberately, its face turned toward me. Its mouth moved, and I heard it in my head. Tom. I fired. The thing vanished. The next day, I packed. I didn't care about the job. I didn't care about the radio. I was getting out. I hiked out on foot, past the trees with dolls, past the stacked rocks that now lined the trail every 100 feet. The humming followed me the whole way, sometimes in my ears, sometimes behind me. Once I turned and saw a line of figures standing in the woods. 10, maybe 15 of them. All motionless, all staring. I didn't stop. I reached the truck just after sundown. The battery was dead. I hadn't touched it in over a week. That didn't make sense. I locked the doors and waited till daylight. Then I started walking. It took me 2 days to reach the road. A trucker picked me up, asked if I was part of the team restoring the old parkland. I was, I said. He just nodded. Used to be a town up there, you know. Hargrove. Early 1900s. Whole place burned down. They said it was an accident. I looked at him. You believe that? He shook his head slowly. Folks said the Hargroves were into strange things. Mountain magic. Rituals. When the fire came, nobody tried to put it out. Let the whole town burn. Said it was better that way. I didn't respond. I never went back. Quit the job. Changed numbers. Didn't tell anyone where I'd been. Sometimes I still hear it, late at night. That humming, that soft whisper. Tom. Story the end.
Story number 13.
It was late October when I agreed to help my friend Rob clear out his late uncle's cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The place had been left untouched since his uncle passed in the spring, and Rob didn't want to go alone. We both grew up in the same coal mining town on the Virginia side of the Appalachians and knew the woods pretty well, but this cabin sat further out than most people dared to go. Old mountain folk called the stretch of forest around it Dead Crow Hollow. Even as kids, we heard stories about the place, tales of people going missing, strange lights at night, sounds that mimicked voices you trusted. We laughed it off back then, but now, in our 30s, something about it made us hesitate. The road leading there had half washed away in a spring flood, so we had to hike the last couple of miles in. It was cold, and the trees had already shed most of their leaves, making the ground a rustling blanket of browns and reds. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to crowd in around us. There were no birds chirping, no squirrels darting through underbrush, just wind and silence. When we reached the cabin, it looked like it had clawed itself out of the earth. The roof sagged in places, and ivy had crept up the stone chimney. A rusted rocking chair sat motionless on the front porch, like it had been waiting decades for someone to come sit in it. The air smelled like damp earth and decay. Inside was even worse, musty and dark. The windows were smeared with dirt, letting in just enough light to see the outlines of old furniture and dust-covered books. There were piles of junk, broken radios, yellowing newspapers, and shelves filled with jars of God knows what. Rob's uncle had been something of a recluse. According to Rob, he'd gone almost entirely off the grid the last 10 years of his life, rambling to neighbors about things in the trees and watchers on the ridge. We started cleaning around mid-afternoon, stacking trash in black contractor bags and setting aside anything Rob wanted to keep. The work was quiet, both of us too focused, or maybe too uneasy to talk much. Around 5, Rob found something strange under the floorboards in the bedroom. A shoebox wrapped in duct tape. Inside were a few black and white photos, a couple of silver coins, and a leather-bound journal. Most of the writing inside was barely legible, scrawled in what looked like a mix of English and some symbols I didn't recognize. Rob flipped through the pages slowly, frowning. He was going crazy, he muttered. Listen to this. They come from the holler where the mist never breaks. I heard Maddie calling, and she's been dead 15 years. I didn't know what to say. The air in the cabin suddenly felt heavier, like something had shifted. I chalked it up to reading creepy ramblings in an old cabin as the sun was going down. We decided to stop for the night, too tired to haul our sleeping bags back down the trail. We built a fire in the ancient wood stove, which miraculously still worked. We heated some soup and drank whiskey from a flask Rob had brought. By the time the sun fully set, the forest was black as pitch, pressing against the windows like a living thing. That's when we heard it. Scratching. faint at first, like something dragging nails across wood. It was coming from the far side of the cabin. We both froze. "You hear that?" Rob asked. "Yeah," I said. "Probably a raccoon." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't. The scratching was rhythmic, methodical. Then it stopped. We sat in silence for a few minutes before deciding to check it out. Rob grabbed a flashlight, and I picked up a rusted fire poker we'd found earlier. We crept down the hallway toward the noise. Nothing was there. No animals, no broken boards, just that same musty smell and the feeling of something unseen watching us. We turned back and decided to call it a night, both of us too stubborn to admit we were spooked. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of whispering. I thought it was Rob at first, but when I looked over, he was out cold in his sleeping bag. The whispering was coming from outside. I strained to hear it, and it sounded like someone calling my name. "Ben, come outside." It was a woman's voice, soft and sweet, but drawn out in a way that made my stomach clench. "Ben." I stood up and edged toward the window, pulling back the curtain just an inch. There, standing at the tree line, was a figure, pale and unmoving. A woman with long, dark hair wearing what looked like a nightgown. I backed away fast and shook Rob awake. "There's someone outside," I hissed. He sat up groggily. "What? Who?" I pulled him toward the window, but when we looked again, she was gone. Just trees and mist, thick and swirling now, though there hadn't been any mist earlier. We stayed up the rest of the night, both of us too shaken to sleep. Every so often, we'd hear something scrape across the porch or what sounded like footsteps in the leaves just beyond the window. Morning brought no relief. The woods were still shrouded in fog, and the trail back to the truck had vanished beneath it. We decided to wait a few hours before heading out. I flipped through the journal again, searching for anything about a woman. I found a passage dated 1982. "She stands at the edge of the trees, always callin'. She ain't my Maddie. Maddie's been dead and buried since 1935. That thing out there just wears her face." Another page had a drawing, crude, childlike, but unmistakable. The woman I'd seen. Her eyes were empty circles, her mouth open too wide, and her fingers long and clawed. Beneath it, he'd written, "Don't follow her voice. Don't answer when she calls." That was enough for me. I told Rob we needed to leave immediately. We packed quickly and headed into the woods, compass in hand, but something was off. The forest felt unfamiliar. The landmarks I remembered were gone. We walked for hours, but the trail never appeared. At one point, we passed the same dead tree with a lightning scar 3 times. "We're going in circles," Rob said, panicking. Then we heard her again. "Ben, Robert." The voice echoed through the trees, soft and melodic. This time, Rob looked at me, eyes wide. "That's my mom's voice," he whispered. "She used to sing that to me when I was a kid." We stood still, paralyzed. I grabbed his arm. "It's not her," I said. "Don't listen to it." But Rob took a step toward the voice, his eyes glassy. "Rob!" I shouted. He blinked and turned back, like waking from a trance. I almost went. That night, we found our way back to the cabin. Somehow, despite walking all day, we'd ended up right where we started. Exhausted and scared, we barred the doors and windows and every lamp and candle we could find. Around midnight, the wind started howling, and with it came the voice. Louder this time, and angry. "You shouldn't have come back." We heard footsteps on the roof, then scratching down the walls, then pounding on the door. Not like fists, like something enormous trying to rip it down. The room grew cold. The fire died out in the stove without reason. My breath misted in the air. Rob clutched the journal like a lifeline, flipping to the last page. It just said, "To leave, you must give back what you took." "What did we take?" Rob asked. I remembered the photos, the locket, the coins, the box from under the floor. We threw everything into the fireplace and set it ablaze. The flames roared to life, unnaturally tall and blue. The screaming outside stopped. Then silence. When the fire died, the temperature returned to normal. The pounding ceased. We didn't sleep. We waited for daylight, and as soon as it came, the fog had lifted. The path was there, clear as it ever was. We didn't look back. We made it to the truck, drove in silence until we hit the main road. A week later, Rob sold the land and the cabin to the county. They planned to demolish it. I never found out if they did. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear her voice in the trees outside my house, calling my name, and I never answer. Story the end.
Story number 14.
Back in the summer of 2018, I took a solo trip into the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. I had just graduated college and wanted to unplug from the world before starting a job in Atlanta. My plan was to spend a week hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail, pitching my tent along the route, and soaking in the quiet. I was used to the outdoors. I grew up camping and backpacking, but something about this trip felt different from the start. It felt too still, like the land itself was waiting for something. The first few days went as expected. I parked my car at a trailhead near Hot Springs, North Carolina, and set off north. The weather was warm but overcast, and a humid haze clung to the mountains like sweat. Even though it was June, I barely saw another soul. Just a few thru hikers going the opposite way and an older couple birdwatching near Max Patch. I welcomed the solitude. That was what I came for. By the fourth day, I had moved well off the more trafficked areas of the trail, heading toward an unmaintained side path I had read about in an old hiking forum. It supposedly led to an abandoned fire lookout from the 1930s. No markers, just word-of-mouth directions. When the trail dips after the second ridge, look for a rock shaped like a sleeping dog. Turn left there. You'll see a faint trail if the brush hasn't eaten it. I found the rock. It did look like a dog curled up. The trail was more like a suggestion. Ferns and vines fought to reclaim it. But I pushed forward. The idea of finding that fire lookout, with its high vantage point and old stonework, felt like a reward for my detour. The hike to the lookout took most of the afternoon. I reached it just as the sun started to dip behind the hills. The tower itself had long collapsed, but the stone base remained, along with a rusted spiral of stairs that led to nowhere. I set up my tent on the flattest part of the clearing and made a small fire. I didn't need it for warmth, just for comfort. That night, something woke me up around 2 a.m. It wasn't a sound, exactly. More like the absence of sound. The woods, which usually hummed with insects and distant owl calls, had gone completely still. Not even the breeze moved. I unzipped my tent and poked my head out. The fire had long died out, and a thin mist had rolled in. It pooled low to the ground, swirling faintly even though the air was dead. My skin crawled. I couldn't see anything, not clearly, but I had the strangest feeling that something was standing at the edge of the clearing, just watching. I stared into the dark for what felt like hours, unable to make sense of why I felt so deeply afraid. Finally, the mist began to lift, and the sounds of the forest returned. Slowly, as if someone had turned a volume knob. I went back inside the tent and didn't sleep until dawn. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Maybe I'd had a nightmare that lingered after waking. Maybe I'd spooked myself with too many ghost stories and solitude. But the feeling didn't go away. I packed up quickly and decided to head back to the main trail. As I retraced my steps, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A cairn. A small stack of stones, about waist high, stood directly in the center of the trail. I stopped and stared at it. Cairns weren't uncommon on hiking trails, but this one felt wrong. The stones were wet, like they'd been pulled from a riverbed, and reddish moss clung to their undersides. Something about it felt fresh, placed deliberately, as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped around it carefully and kept walking. Over the next couple hours, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I'd stop to tie my boot or adjust my pack and swear I heard leaves crunching behind me. Once, I even called out, "Hello," thinking maybe someone else had stumbled onto the path. No answer. Just the distant call of a crow, sharp and solitary. When I made it back to the main trail, I felt a wave of relief, like I had crossed some invisible border. I kept hiking until dusk and pitched camp in a small clearing beside a creek. Other than some raccoons rustling near my food bag, the night passed without incident. It wasn't until the next morning that things got worse. When I woke up, I found footprints around my tent. They were human, barefoot, but oddly wide and flat. The impressions were deep, even though the ground wasn't especially soft, like whoever made them had been heavy or pressing down with force. They circled the tent twice and then vanished into the woods. I didn't pack up. I just grabbed my essentials and started hiking. I told myself I'd come back for the rest later, but deep down, I knew I wouldn't. I was done. I needed to get out of the mountains. The nearest road crossing was about 7 miles out, and I nearly jogged the entire way. I didn't stop for water, food, or rest. The whole time, I felt like something was right behind me, just out of sight, matching my pace. By the time I reached the road, my legs were shaking. I flagged down the first car I saw, an older man in a pickup, and told him I'd gotten lost. He gave me a ride into Hot Springs and dropped me off at the general store. That should have been the end of it. But the worst came later. 2 weeks after I returned home, I started waking up in the middle of the night to the same dead silence I'd felt in the mountains. No city noise, no birds or wind, just absolute stillness. It always happened around 2 a.m. And each time, I'd feel the same weight on my chest, like I was being stared at. The third time it happened, I sat up and saw something in the corner of my bedroom. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make out a tall, thin figure. It had no discernible face, just a smooth, pale head. Its arms hung too low, nearly touching the floor, and its chest rose and fell as if it were breathing slowly. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stared as it slowly turned and slipped through my closed closet door without a sound. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, or the next. Desperate, I tried to rationalize it. Sleep paralysis, a waking dream. But then I noticed something even more disturbing, a red smear on my bedroom floor near the closet. Like moss or dried blood. It reeked faintly of iron and rot. I scrubbed it clean and tried to forget. But it happened again, and again. I went to a sleep clinic, hoping they'd give me something to knock me out for good. But every time they wired me up and monitored my sleep, the same thing would happen. My vitals would spike around 2:03 a.m., and I'd wake up screaming. The technicians eventually refused to run more tests. At the end of my rope, I went back to the mountains. It was a stupid idea, I know. But I thought maybe if I returned to where it started, I could put it to rest. I didn't go back to the fire tower. I couldn't bring myself to, but I camped a few miles from where I first saw the cairn. That night, the silence came again, but this time I didn't hide. I stepped out of the tent and walked toward the woods, following the same sensation that had haunted me for months. I found another cairn. Only this one had something on top, a piece of fabric. It was blue, nylon, frayed at the edges. I recognized it immediately. It was from my tent, the one I'd left behind in my panic. I stared at it for a long time, then turned to leave. And that's when I heard the whisper. Not words, exactly, but something guttural, like wind pressed through broken wood. I turned back, and the cairn had changed. It was taller now, fresh stones stacked on top. Wet. Red-streaked. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and I drove straight home without sleeping. I moved 2 weeks later, changed my number, stopped hiking. I haven't been back to the Appalachians since, but sometimes when I'm up late and the world goes quiet, I think I hear something in the walls, a low rustling, a breath, and once I found red moss growing on the inside of my closet door. Story the end.
Story number 15.
There was an old ranger station tucked away in a forgotten bend of the Appalachian Trail, somewhere between Irwin and Hot Springs, North Carolina. It hadn't been used officially in over 20 years. The Forest Service had pulled out when maintaining that stretch became too much of a hassle. Landslides, storms, and the sheer remoteness made it impractical. Still, a handful of hikers knew about it, and sometimes people used it in emergencies or when the weather turned. I was one of those hikers. It was late October, and the cold came down early that year. I was section hiking the trail, planning to spend a week alone, trying to unplug from everything. My gear was solid, and I was confident in my backwoods skills. I'd been through a handful of sketchy nights, bad weather, animals, even a strange encounter or two with drifters, but nothing that scared me off. The weather turned nasty on the third day. Thick fog rolled in like smoke, and by nightfall, the rain had gotten cold enough to sting. I was close to the old ranger station. I'd read about it on a forum, and a guy posted GPS coordinates saying it was still mostly intact and had a working fireplace. I veered off trail and trudged through the underbrush until I found it, standing like a memory of better days. The place was a wooden 2-room cabin, one main area with a fireplace and built-in bunk, and a back room that must have been used for storage or food. The roof leaked a bit, but it beat the rain. I built a small fire and hung my wet clothes to dry. The wind outside howled, but in there it was quiet. A good kind of quiet, or so I thought. That night, I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint tapping. At first, I thought it was just wind hitting a branch against the wall, but it was too rhythmic. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps again. It was coming from the back room. I stayed still, heart pounding. Maybe an animal had gotten in, I told myself. A raccoon or something. I had a small hunting knife in my pack. I slipped it into my hoodie pocket and crept toward the back room. The door was warped, and it creaked when I pushed it open. I aimed my flashlight around. Dust, some old shelves, a rusted canteen, bits of chewed insulation. Nothing moved. No raccoon. I was about to shut the door when I noticed something. The window on the back wall, the glass long gone, had handprints on the sill. Not fresh, but not ancient either. Smudged into the wood like someone leaned in. Too high for a raccoon. I closed the door and shoved a chair against it. Didn't sleep again till morning. Next day was dead quiet. The fog never lifted, and the woods looked distorted, like the trees were melting. I stayed near the cabin, figuring I'd dry out and move on when the weather cleared. By mid-afternoon, I noticed something odd. Despite the cold, I felt warm, too warm, like I was sweating even though I wasn't moving around much. I chalked it up to sitting close to the fire, but even when I stepped outside, I still felt flushed. That evening, I went out to collect more firewood. The sun never fully came out, so it felt like dusk all day. I wandered a bit further than I should have. After 10 minutes, I turned back and couldn't see the cabin. Just fog and trees. I wasn't panicked, not yet. I had my compass, and I had marked a few trees with orange tape. I followed the marks, but they didn't lead back to the cabin. Instead, they led to something else. There was a small clearing I didn't remember passing earlier. In the center was a single stone, tall, narrow, old. A grave marking on it, just smoothed over by years of rain and wind. Around it, the ground was disturbed, like something had been digging. I stood there, staring, trying to figure out how I missed this. Then I heard a sound behind me. A breath. Close enough to feel it on the back of my neck. I spun around. Nothing. Just fog. I ran. I don't remember choosing a direction. I just ran until I stumbled into the clearing around the cabin again. The trees looked taller, the fog heavier. I slammed the door shut and threw every piece of gear I had in front of it. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just sat there, knife in hand, watching the windows until morning. I was going to leave that day, but I couldn't find the trail. The GPS was useless. It showed me in the same spot no matter where I walked. I tried to backtrack, but the woods changed. Nothing looked familiar. Eventually I found the grave marker again. That damn stone just stood there like it had always been. That night the tapping came back, louder, more erratic. It was on the walls now, not just the back room. I sat by the fireplace, rocking slightly, holding that knife so tight my knuckles turned white. Sometime after midnight, the tapping stopped. I thought maybe it was over. Then I heard breathing again. Inside this time. From the back room. I couldn't bring myself to move. I just waited, not blinking. The door creaked open slowly, and I saw something in the doorway. A shadow, darker than the rest of the room, tall and bent like it didn't fit right inside the space. I couldn't see a face, just the shape. It stood there for what felt like hours, then vanished like smoke sucked into a vent. Next morning, the fire was dead, and all my gear was wet. My matches were soaked, flashlight dead. I couldn't warm up no matter how many layers I put on. My skin felt thin, like paper. I decided to leave everything and just walk until I found someone, something. I walked all day, and nothing changed. Fog, trees, more fog. No animals, no wind, just dead silence. By the 5th day, I didn't even remember my own name for a while. I had started talking to the trees. I think I even talked to the grave marker once, asking it to let me go. Just let me out. That's when I realized I hadn't heard birds in days. No squirrels, not even bugs. That night, I dreamed of fire. Not comforting, campfire flames. Just white-hot, roaring, unnatural fire. And in the middle of it stood a figure. Same shape, same bent posture. It didn't move. Just watched me. I woke up with a scream lodged in my throat. I don't know how I got out. That morning, the fog was thinner. The trees looked right again. I picked a direction and walked. 3 hours later, I heard traffic, distant but real. I stumbled out onto a road near a gas station and collapsed. A trucker called 911. I told the ranger who came to talk to me what had happened. He looked at me like he'd heard parts of the story before. When I mentioned the grave marker, he got quiet. "There's a handful of old graves in those hills," he said. "Settlers, miners, folks who disappeared in the early 1900s. Some people say that land never settled properly. Too many bones underfoot." I asked him about the cabin. He said it was real, but no one had been out there in years. A week later, I went back. Stupid, I know, but I needed proof I wasn't crazy. I went with 2 friends, armed to the teeth with GPS, radios, even a satellite phone. We found the clearing. The cabin was gone. No ruins, no foundation, just trees and moss like it had never been there at all. But we did find the stone, same one, same clearing. This time there were words carved into it. "Return to sleep and stay beneath." None of us slept that night. We left before sundown. Sometimes I still dream of the fog, of that shadow watching me through the fire. Some nights I wake up with the feeling that I'm still in the cabin, and if I open my eyes, I'll see it again, waiting in the doorway. I don't hike alone anymore, and I never go near that stretch of trail again. Story, the end.
Story number 16.
It was just after the 4th of July when I took the solo trip through the Appalachian Mountains. I'd spent the past year behind a desk in Charlotte, balancing supply orders and sales logs, and it had drained the life out of me. I needed something raw, something that put me back in touch with the dirt and trees. So I packed up my old Tacoma, threw in a tent, some canned food, a water filter, and a solar power bank. The plan was to hike about 20 miles into a less traveled section near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, pitch camp, and spend 3 nights alone with nature. The area I chose was intentionally remote. It was past Clingman's Dome, through unmarked trails locals called the Lost Lines. Old ranger maps showed some crude paths dating back to the 1960s, but much of that terrain hadn't been maintained in decades. It was the kind of place hikers whispered about in gas stations and dive bars. "Don't go up that ridge alone," they'd say. "Strange things happen up there." I chalked it up to backwoods superstition. The first day was peaceful. Birds flitted through thick branches, the air smelled sweet with mountain laurel, and the forest floor was soft with pine needles. Around mid-afternoon, I came across the remnants of an old log cabin, just the stone foundation and a single wall left standing. Moss had grown over the rocks, and rusted nails jutted from broken boards. I took a few pictures and moved on, eventually settling near a creek at the base of a ridge. That first night, something felt off. The forest got quiet, dead quiet. Right after dusk. No crickets, no owls, no wind rustling through the leaves. Just a heavy stillness that pressed in from all sides. I sat by my fire, listening to the silence, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a predator was nearby, a bobcat or bear, but I never heard a single branch snap, never saw glowing eyes reflecting the firelight. Then, just past midnight, I heard the bells. They were faint, high-pitched, almost like sleigh bells. They seemed to come from up the ridge, echoing down through the trees. At first, I thought it might be an animal with something caught around its neck, some old livestock gone feral, but the rhythm was too deliberate. 3 rings, pause, then 3 more. It repeated twice, then stopped completely. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I hiked to the top of the ridge to see if there were any signs of movement. About 100 feet from the peak, I found an old trail, nearly overgrown, but still visible if you knew what to look for. Flattened ferns, a broken branch here and there. It led to a clearing where 4 stone markers stood, arranged in a perfect square. They looked like graves, but didn't have names, just carved symbols I didn't recognize, circles, slashes, crude animal figures. At the center of the square was a small pile of burnt twigs and ash. I backed away slowly and returned to camp, but all day I had the sense of being watched. I'd glance over my shoulder and think I saw movement behind the trees, a quick flash of gray or white slipping out of sight. That night, the forest was dead quiet again. No bells this time, but just as I was dozing off inside my tent, I heard breathing, close, raspy, just on the other side of the nylon wall. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't animal breathing, it was too rhythmic, too human. I reached slowly for my flashlight and clicked it on. The breathing stopped. I waited 30 seconds, then unzipped the tent and shined the light outside. Nothing. No tracks. No signs of anything. But when I turned around, I saw something scratched into the wall of my tent. It hadn't been there earlier. 3 vertical lines. I broke camp at first light, but instead of heading back down the mountain, I made a mistake. I took a wrong turn, possibly out of panic or just poor navigation, and ended up deeper in the woods. My GPS wouldn't connect, and the compass kept spinning like something magnetic was interfering with it. I tried to retrace my steps, but the trees started to look the same, and the light filtering through the canopy was oddly dim, like the sun itself had dulled. By mid-afternoon, I came across a weathered wooden sign nailed to a tree. It read, "Turn back." The letters were hand-carved, jagged, uneven. Beneath it was a deer skull nailed to the trunk with rusted spikes. The eye sockets were stuffed with dried flowers. I turned around and began hiking fast, almost jogging, but the trail looped back on itself. Every time I thought I was moving in a straight line, I'd find something I'd already passed, like the old cabin ruins from the first day, except this time there were fresh footprints in the dirt leading into what was left of the structure. I stood at the edge, debating whether to investigate, when I saw someone inside. Just a flash, shoulder-length dark hair, pale skin, wearing some kind of old-timey dress. The figure was hunched in a corner, motionless, almost like they'd been waiting. I didn't move, and neither did they. Then, slowly, the head turned, and I saw the eyes, wide, sunken, black as coal. The lips peeled back in a grin, revealing jagged, broken teeth. And then she stood. I ran. Twilight came fast, and the forest swallowed what was left of the day. I stumbled and tripped down an embankment that twisted my ankle and landed hard beside a dry creek bed. I lay there for minutes, panting, listening for movement. At first there was nothing. Then I heard footsteps, deliberate, crunching leaves, getting closer. I pulled myself behind a fallen log and held my breath. A figure came into view, barefoot, lanky, with unnaturally long limbs. It moved with a jerky, puppet-like motion, as if it didn't fully understand how to use its body. It stopped right near the log, sniffed the air, then tilted its head sharply to the left, like it was listening. For a full minute, it stood like that, and then, just as suddenly, it took off into the woods, faster than anything I've ever seen move on two legs. I stayed hidden until nightfall, then limped in the direction I thought might lead out. I walked for hours, using a stick to support my weight. Eventually, I spotted a faint orange glow in the distance. Thinking it might be another camper or a ranger, I made my way toward it. What I found was a circle of small fires arranged around the same 4 stone markers I'd seen before. The fires flickered low, almost blue in color. In the center, a woman stood with her back to me, arms outstretched, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Around her, 6 other figures knelt in the dirt, heads bowed, rocking slightly in rhythm. I couldn't look away. Then the woman turned, and her face was painted white, with black streaks running down from her eyes like tears. Her mouth opened, but the sound that came out was not human. It was like a high-pitched whine, a shriek that dug into my ears and made me fall to my knees. The others looked up at once. Their faces were wrong, twisted, stretched too long, eyes glowing faintly like embers. One of them pointed directly at me, and the others began to rise. I ran again. At some point, I must have passed out from exhaustion or shock. When I woke, it was morning. The fires were gone, the figures gone, no sign of the stone markers, just trees. Birds were chirping again. I limped for miles, eventually finding a service road that led me to an old ranger station, now used only seasonally. A volunteer hiker was there with a truck. When I told him where I'd been, his expression changed. "You're lucky you got out," he said. "People go missing up there, always have." Locals say that ridge is cursed, something about old settlements, pre-Civil War, folks practicing things they weren't supposed to. People burned alive in their homes, others just vanished. My granddad's Ed said their spirits never left, said they guard the mountain. I tried to laugh it off, but he wasn't smiling. He dropped me off at the nearest town, and I never went back. Sometimes, though, I still hear the bells. Late at night, when everything's quiet. 3 chimes, a pause, then 3 more. Story the end.